You're fine. Anywhere you go, you're okay. Yeah, great. Hand it over to Mirian. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mirian. Oh, let me time myself. You're gonna time me.
Yeah, I'll give you the 10-minute you asked.
Okay. So, my name is Mirian. I'm gonna talk about effective schools in poor neighborhoods. You may be familiar with Arnold Spirit Jr. from the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. He was very poor and he decided to go to school out of the reservation, because the school in his neighborhood was very bad. The problem is that the good school where he wanted to go to was very far, so sometimes they didn't have gas money, sometimes the car broke down, he had to hitchhike, he had to walk, sometimes he didn't go to school at all. Next week it started all over again, but in a different order. So this is just to illustrate the drama that many families face when they decide to send their children to a better school outside of their neighborhoods. That's why I decided to talk about highly effective schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And yes, they are possible, and I'm going to tell you how. So the reason why I became curious about this topic was because I had many friends who are immigrants like me. I come from Brazil. And I noticed that the most common practice of immigrant families who have children is that, because they are recently arrived immigrants, they usually don't have a lot of money, so they end up having to send their kids to public school. Not a lot of choice there. Because they're immigrants, they have and because of Bill 101, they have to send their children to French school if it's public, right? You know that. So a very common practice was to consult a school ranking, and one of the most common ones, if not the only one, is called the palmarès on the newspaper La Presse, published every year on La Presse. And a very common practice was for them to look at the ranking and choose the very best schools and move to that neighborhood, because they didn't have any emotional attachment to any neighborhood in the city, right? So it was easy for them to just choose the neighborhood like that. If you've never looked at this palmarès on La Presse, it looks a little bit like this. So each pin is a school. The green ones are what they call the superior grades. They have higher than average grades. The yellow ones are what they call central, and the red ones are inferior. You can see here, for example, on the east side of Montreal, it's the territory of the Commission Scolaire de la Pointe de l'Île. They don't release the scores, and it's the choice of the school board. They may or may not release the scores. Here we're looking at Commission Scolaire de Montréal, Marguerite Bourgeois, and some outside of the island. If you click on Tableau, you can see, you can go down and see that besides having the ranking per grade, they also have three groups. They have privileged, moderately privileged, and underprivileged. And you will see that the best school here is better than the best school here, which is better than the best school here. So if you're choosing, and you're willing to move anywhere, why not choose the best of the best, right? So a lot of people end up moving to very rich neighborhoods, and one of the problems, you can see very well because it's too small, sorry about this, but this is a popular choice amongst my friends. For example, Académie Saint-Clément. It's in TMR, Town of Mont Royal, 11th on the ranking, and it's a very expensive place to live in. So another problem that they face is that they go there to offer good schooling to their children, but they end up giving bad housing because they don't have the money to pay for good housing in a very expensive neighborhood. So I wanted to know if that choice made sense at all, and if there could be effective schools in poor neighborhoods, and how. So that was my research question. Unfortunately, most of the data that I found was in the United States, but you're going to see that a lot of the things that we see here are generalizable. The old research had already established a very strong correlation between poverty and low academic achievement. That was very, very strongly established in the past. And it keeps coming up in new research as well. But as you know, correlation doesn't mean causation. So they thought in the past that because you were poor, you were never gonna have good academic achievement. But now they know that there are other variables involved in the problem, right? So one of the differences between the research in the past and the new research is that in the past they focused on measuring school resources to see if poor kids were getting the same resources as rich kids. So for example, the same number of teachers, the same kinds of buildings, the same books. But nowadays, they're more concerned about how schools are organized and led, and they think that that says more about how, why the school is able to help students produce good scores in standardized tests. And the goal is not to focus on individual talent. So yes, it's great if there's one teacher who's able to perform miracles, but what they're looking for is systematic ways to create and support these effective schools. So they look at the outliers, the exceptions, to see if they can find out how those outliers can produce those great results of good scores in poor neighborhoods, to see how they can create the same opportunities at scales in other poor neighborhoods, or in schools that serve other poor kids. So like I said, most of the data that I have here is from the United States, and it's two large-scale studies, one by the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. Oh no, it's the Education Trust that it's in Washington, D.C. The other one, I don't know where it is, but both of them are in the United States. So the Urban Institute Effective School Study compared two different districts, Cumberland City and Rios Calientes. Those are not the real names. So I guess they are in Tennessee and California, but I'm not sure. They decided not to use the real names for some reason. Or they compared the typical schools with highly effective schools. They're all elementary schools in that case. And the Education Trust studies compared elementary, middle, and high schools. And I'm going to mention a few things about studies in Lexington, Massachusetts, Steubenville, Ohio, and Chicago, Illinois. So this is the book about the first study that I mentioned, Good Schools in Poor Neighborhoods. And this is the podcast of the Education Trust studies, where I found these scatter plot graphs, where you can see poorer students on the left, richer students on the right, and here is the grade level. So you can see, for example, that Lexington, Massachusetts is the best school district in the United States. However, it's the orange circle here. They found out that minority students in that district were left behind. So there was a huge gap between white students and black students, or Asian students, Latino students, for example. So they had to do something about it. Here we see Steubenville, Ohio. So they're poor, but they're one grade ahead of the average. So they're considered an extraordinary district because they have very good results in elementary. And here we have Chicago, which used to be one of the worst school districts in the United States, but they have been showing a lot of progress in the past years, and I'm going to summarize how they were able to do that. So basically, all of those districts had a problem to solve, and they had to create some sort of school turnaround to be able to solve the problem. And both studies, the Urban Institute study and the Consortium of Chicago Schools research study, found very, very similar results. These are the 5 main characteristics of highly effective schools in poor places. So I'd like to know, at the end you can tell me if you have noticed this in schools in Quebec as well in your experience. So we're used to thinking that high teacher quality is the most important, but surprisingly they have found out that principal leadership comes first. Of course this is important, but if you have high teacher quality without having principal leadership, the good teachers are not going to stay in the school. So you can have perhaps one class with good results, but not the entire school or not the entire district. So it's very important to have a good principal, because the principal will be able to convince the teachers if some change has to be made, and they're going to be able to keep high quality teachers and also establish high parent and community involvement. So if you're a parent or if you're a teacher who communicates with the parents of your students, and you know that the school puts a lot of obstacles between the school and the parents, there's a red flag too. It's a bad sign. There has to be high parent involvement, and the Chicago Consortium study also says that there has to be community involvement. So not only the families of the students, but everyone around the school, all the businesses, the neighbors, everyone around the school has to be involved. Of course, we know good discipline is very important, good school climate, but the consortium study goes beyond. It talks a lot about safety, talks about creating an environment that's student-centered. So thinking from the point of view of a child, of a student, and not only an adult. So everything from the architecture to the decoration, everything has to be thought of from the point of view of the student who's going to spend most of their days there. And it's also very important to have high expectations for students and ambitious instruction. So those are very, very important characteristics found very strongly in highly effective schools. A few other important characteristics are school reform following a wide educational philosophy, system, program, instructional guidance, and sometimes also curriculum alignment. So one of the most common examples that they give is the program Success for All in the United States, which helps teachers teach math and reading. I'm not familiar with it, but according to what I researched, some new teachers, they really like the guidance. But old teachers, they complain that it's too strict. But with time, you can tailor it according to your needs, according to what you prefer. So it's not so strict as some people may think. It's also very important to have school integration of all races and economic backgrounds. So not only white, not only black, not only Muslim, very, very important to try to mix all races, all communities, as many communities as possible in the same school. Also very important to use public money that's available for poor schools. Cultural sensitivity was a topic that came up very much also in the research. I remember, for example, when I was subbing one day in spring, and I had 20 students in grade 6, and I think 17 of them were fasting for Ramadan, which was very surprising to me because I thought that children didn't have to do it, but they said that they were practicing for when they grew up. And I guess that's just one example where cultural sensitivity is really important, because I could have just I could have had a very strange reaction, not very accepting, but I found out it was really interesting, and it was a learning point for me as well. Collaboration among teachers, very important, because teaching can be very isolating. If you just close your doors, you do your thing, your principal doesn't bother you, the other teachers don't bother you. Maybe it's comfortable, but it doesn't necessarily produce good results. So those are also very important characteristics. So these are some of the things I would like to change or to improve in my practice, maybe being open to follow the principal leadership, taking responsibilities for my students' learning, involving parents, involving the community, developing my cultural sensitivity. I think the first person was Rob, I think, right? He was talking about Bill 21. So it's a good time to develop cultural sensitivity in classrooms in Quebec. Collaborating with other teachers. I have some suggestions for future research also. I understand the limitations because that's research that was done in the United States, but I think we can generalize some of the findings to Quebec and Canada as well. So thank you very much. I would like to know if you have any questions or comments, if you have any experience where you have seen these characteristics in the classrooms where you have worked. Thank you.
I have a question. Don't you think that maybe if private schools were harder for people to get into, that you would have a better education system? Because the private schools are very selective. They take only the smart ones. Anyone with special needs they don't take. And then what happens is, in the public school, all the ones that are there because, you know, they are special needs, or they're this or they're that. It makes it more concentrated than it would be if everybody was in like a public school.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you want to have a private school, okay, fine, but it shouldn't be like private schools everywhere. It should be public education.
Mm-hmm.
That way, if you have people in the community, and people who would send their kids to private schools will be more wealthy, they might take more of an interest in their public school if their students were going there. They would go there and they'd say, well, okay, maybe I can help with this. Maybe I can help with that. I think it goes back to what you were saying about involvement of the community.
Yep.
You have all of the community involved instead of just, well, the ones that are stuck here, you know, are here and that's it. But the richer people or the ones that have more intelligent students or whatever get to go to an environment where you don't have to worry about you know, someone disrupting a class as much as they would in a public school, because in a public school you have much less tools to deal with that. You know, you can suspend somebody for a day or two, but they're going to come back again.
Yeah.
Whereas in a private school, they throw them out. Now, if everybody was going to, like I say, a public school would become more of a, you know, a community place where all kinds of things could take place.
Yeah.
And people would start to, you know, appreciate their school and appreciate the community in a whole. And I just thought that maybe that's one of the problems that we're having now. So many people are going to the private schools, and they're not necessarily getting a better education. Teachers are probably, a lot of them are probably more qualified than the ones that are in the private schools. Because private schools, they can take anybody they want, where there's more rules in the public system.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned about special needs students. One of the problems that they found out in Lexington, Massachusetts was that for their Black population, they were receiving requests up to 49% of their Black student population were told to be special needs. And then the researchers started asking the teachers, okay, so this is much higher than the general population of Black people outside of the school. This is statistics, this percentage doesn't make sense. Do you really think that this many Black students are disabled? And when he used the word disabled, then people started paying attention, and it started a conversation about the fact that a lot of kids are coded special needs when they actually aren't given the proper tools, such as differentiation and just good teaching, you know, like just basic good teaching. Sometimes students are expected to learn by themselves.
That's a good point. Right? That's in the States. That's a little different.
Yeah,
you don't have the same kind of you know, the environment in the States between black and white is a lot different than it is black and white here, you know? It's like,
Oh, yeah. That's
because,
just
you
an
know,
example.
Yeah, you know, it's like you've got this white guilt, this black this, and all this. Whereas I think anybody who came here that was of a different color or different religion came because they wanted to come. They weren't packed on a boat and brought over as slaves for more for 300 years. That still goes on today. That's a different tip.
Yeah,
That's
but there's still a lot of kids who are coded special needs without being supposed to be
Right.
coded special
So I think
needs.
knowing that we've got, if there's anybody else that had a question or a comment, then we want to take one more from anybody else in the, anybody else have a question? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.